Chair, it's good to know you do wear pants.
You're live.
My League of Women Voters official water bottle. Shout out to women voters.
Chair, you're streaming live.
Okay. Who are we missing? Jalen Hawks. Looks like we're missing Jalen, but we have a quorum, so we'll go ahead and get started. So I will call this meeting of the Arches Hotspot Region Coordinating Committee to order at 1:02 p.m. Before we have an approval of minutes, would like to welcome the committee members, staff, Monty Aldridge, Jeff Sanders, Jared Beard from UDOT Department of Transportation. Thank you for being here. And with that, I would entertain a motion to approve minutes.
I will move to approve unless there are other edits that I don't know about.
Motion on the floor from Councilmember Duncan. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second from Councilmember Guzman Newton. Any discussion?
Do we need the date of the minutes read into the record?
Yeah, the 23rd of April, I believe.
Yes, sir. Okay. Any other discussion? Seeing none, I'll call for a roll call vote. Councilmember Clapper,
Yes.
Councilmember Guzman Newton,
Yes.
Committee Member Shannon,
Yes.
Councilmember Jones,
Yes.
and Councilmember Wells votes yes. Minutes approved 6. Any opposed? See none. Minutes approved 6-0.
Don't forget Duncan.
Sorry, Councilmember Duncan.
Aye.
That's it.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
sorry about that, Mike.
No problem.
Minutes approved 6-0. Let's see, next up on the agenda, we have citizens to be heard. Help me out with citizens to be heard, Summer or Carly. Do we have any citizens that are in the meeting now, or?
No, we have them fill out a comment sheet, and that's available on the agenda, but we didn't receive any comments this time around. Please.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone got emails. I didn't, but we didn't get any from the forum online.
No, I haven't seen any. So without any citizen comment, we'll move on to item 4 on the agenda, which is a presentation of the shared use path, conceptual design and next steps. Presentation by Grand County Community and Economic Development Director. Is Zachariah on?
I don't see him on here.
Okay. Why don't we, I would entertain a motion to skip to item 5, and then we can go back to 4 after we address item 5. Is there a motion on the floor to move to item 5?
So moves.
Second.
Motion made by Councilmember Clapper, second Hawks. Welcome to the meeting, Councilmember Hawks. Any discussion? Seeing none. All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
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 All opposed? Passes unanimously, 7-0. I forgot to vote, sorry. So item 5 is to be a pretty brief discussion, and essentially it's kind of, I think, where we're at here had some advocacy for public transit projects specific to the hotspot process. Without getting too in depth, UDOT has expressed not related to the immediate feasibility. Long-term public transit is expected to require $750,000, if not more, in annual maintenance. And so, I guess as chairman, I'm seeing that we do have a commitment to public transit from the city and the county and committee members, but we're having a hard time making that fit in the process as a specific project itself, in addition to the financial concerns related to the maintenance. We also have a tight time frame that we're working with to have the final recommendations done by September. So that, with the regional transportation planning process happening, that is ultimately driving, and feasibility of public transit. We have grant process. We've had an ad hoc committee, looking at solutions. Trying to fit the design and development of a public transit system itself it's just not feasible. And so, a thought that I wanted to share with the committee members and the folks that are really committed to public transit, which I think is most of us, is, and with, and Zachariah, is to forward public transit in this process. We have an opportunity as a design requirement for any projects that are chosen subsequent.
Chair, I'm super sorry, but I don't know if it's only me, but I am hearing maybe every third word you say.
Yeah, same here. You're cutting out pretty bad.
Oh, geez, I'm on my 5G, guys. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I have been able to hear you pretty well. Sounds different than what Karen and Wes are reporting.
Well, I'll just slow it down maybe a little bit. But just to reiterate, an option for us as a committee, to forward the interest of public transit, is to include public transit in the design requirements for any and all projects that we select as a committee, with UDOT to present to the transportation. So for instance, if it's any kind of dispersed parking or street improvements, multi-use pathway, a way that we can forward the interest of public transit is to include that in the design requirements for those projects. Before I comment, does that make sense to everyone, what I'm explaining there?
Yeah, I really like that approach. And I think that we also have the ability to spread some of those around the community, so that it's not just like one standalone design, but kind of up and down the valley, or as much as we can that makes sense with the options that are on the table.
Yeah. Mr. Councilmember Duncan.
Yeah. So, Curtis, let me just briefly say, I don't like the idea of discarding transit right at this point. I've been trying to say, and let me say it again, just very briefly, to think small, basically. As a prelude to all that, I'd like to see us get in the habit of using the term dispersed parking much more carefully. That term has been thrown around early in the hotspot process, and they're not really very dispersed by my mind in that context. They're mostly parking lots off Main Street in and near the downtown Moab area. And when we're talking about north and south rec parking, which I've been proposing, those are much more widely dispersed projects, and those are the ones that, in my mind, are candidates for some sort of shuttle service of some sort. All right, because if we the whole impetus in reducing congestion is to try to keep those people from searching for hard to find parking spots on side streets in downtown Moab. Instead, park on easy to find parks north and south of town. And then they need some way to get into town if they're going to go to a restaurant or do whatever it is they want to do. Don't think in terms of a big 50 bus system with roaring diesels running up and down the street. It could be from something as small as, in the spring and fall seasons when the tourist traffic is low, it could even be a on-call sort of thing. Think of an Uber taxi. Instead of a taxi showing up at your door, it could be a small electric vehicle with the city of Moab or Grand County emblazoned on the side. And it could be hybrid vehicles, small vehicles, something jazzy, if you will. Emily would be a proponent of all this, I think. One way to introduce people to new technology and give them something to talk about when they go home from Moab and so forth. There's also, I know in China, I want to thank Joe Kingsley for pointing this out to me. In wide use, there are what I'll call oversized golf carts. Same deal, they're kind of electric vehicles that have to be charged up and hopefully could get through the day alone. But those kinds of very modest fleets, some way it may only take, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 vehicles at the south lot, a similar number at the north lot, but we're talking about a small number of vehicles that we could afford to maintain during the year. That's what I have in mind, because I agree with you guys. We can't support a big fleet of diesel buses. I'm not proposing that. But Karen has used the term hotel hopper the other day. That's a great concept because the idea is to get, by way of this shuttle service, is to get people to leave their vehicles in their hotel parking lots, or and in this case, at the dispersed parking lot. And again, by the word dispersed now, I'm talking about widely dispersed. We could be talking about the hub on the north side of town. We could be talking about, for example, Spanish Trail Arena on the south end of town. And the bike shared path extension down south could fit into all this. Okay, but that's the kind of concept that I'm talking about and why I'm not personally ready to give up on the idea of a shuttle transit system of some sort at this point.
So just for clarification real quick, Mike, I'm not advocating to give up on public transit or abandon it at this point in time. What I'm saying is the ambitions to fund a specific public transit project during the Hotspot program that or committee's work that we're in right now, where we need to have projects identified, designed, and ready for, a request to the Transportation Commission. That adds a depth and a level of stress to the constraints that we're working under, that it would be best to transition to committing to public transit being a component of the projects that we select, but not a singular public transit project. So for instance, for South recreational parking, if those are projects that are selected at the end of today's meeting, we will commit to including public transit design, a design for public transit system in the design requirements of that project. So we're forwarding the interest of public transit, but we would be moving on from pursuing the purchase of like specific public transit vehicles and directly related infrastructure to it. If that makes sense. And you may disagree, that's fine. I just wanted to clarify real quick that, and I just to add, when I discussed this with Zachariah, I encouraged that the city council and the county council should set up a joint meeting that hones in on public transit right away and covers the broad range of things that are happening. For instance, the regional transportation plan, which is driving the public transit right now, the work of the committee that Karen sat on, these federal grant opportunities, for instance, that maybe the hotspot projects that are including public transit in the design, there needs to be kind of a centralized, focused discussion about how we get from where we're at now to public transit, instead of trying to have dueling processes and discussions that are trying to race each other and get out ahead of each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, so I agree entirely. Well, much of what you said, Curtis. Let me put it this way: for example, the north and south recreation parking lots, in my mind, without some sort of shuttle system, without some sort of transit, they're useless. All right, because people are going to come and park their oversized vehicles, and then what? You know, either you're going to force them to disconnect their trailers and drive their tractors into town, so to speak, or you're going to provide some sort of alternative transportation. So I agree with you. A transit system in the context of those north and south rec lots is a component of that project and not a standalone system.
Okay. Do we have any other comments on this specific topic?
Chairman Wells, thank you for that suggestion. Much as I want to see transit in the valley, I think the points about the viability of funding it with Hotspot at this time are well taken. My understanding is that we have a robust transportation planning, including transit, series of projects in the queue, which will ultimately support a well-designed transit system. So I agree that now is the time to choose other projects that support transit as well as other transportation alternatives, and really design for the future of transit, but not necessarily make capital purchases that are transit specific at this time.
Okay. Well said. Any other comments on this item?
Well, I would just like to say, I mean, that price tag that you brought up of, you know, $750,000, that's for the Mac Daddy of transportation systems. That's I mean, that example is used for the Springdale system that picks up we had a small write-up from Jeff that was given to us, and I think it was like 6 minutes or 10 minutes, or I mean, and again, I would agree with Mike. You know, we're looking at something not as complex and involved as that system. And so, I mean, just again, setting up for transit, I mean, because it does seem like we are on a very tight time frame, and that's a very ambitious project. But you know, those parking lots, I mean, I am in total agreement that like setting up for that process, because if it happens in a year and a half or 2 years, you know, that outlay of, you know, potentially paving the Spanish Trail Arena area. I mean, like if we can get something sort of set up, or I mean, I would be apt to want to look at something like that.
Yeah, I think the consensus, you know, if I may, is the scenario we're trying to avoid is if we allow the sensitivity and time and funds of the hotspot process to drive what a public transit system looks like. It would be unfortunate if, like, the regional transportation plan and all the other public transit efforts determined that we could host, you know, a much larger, more expansive, bigger public transportation system, but we headed off in another direction because of the demands of the hotspot process. And so it's more of a, let's take our time, figure out what we really need and what we can afford. But with this hotspot program, let's forward that interest by including public transit in the design requirements. So any other comments on this?
I do have one comment. Maybe it's perhaps a question. Both. I would like to, maybe Monty could answer this. When the planning money was spent, and I know that planning efforts and costs were created with this list of projects, I don't recall any feasibility study being a part of that. And I guess my concern is to spend money on something that people may not use anyway. I would prefer to have, down the road, a feasibility study to see if people would actually use those parking lots. I do agree that they are needed and they need to be used by people. I just would want the confidence going forward that they were actually going to be used to the extent they needed to be. So in short, I'm probably not in favor of forwarding that as a project right now. And if Monty has any words on that topic, that would be great to hear.
I think you're accurate in that we would certainly like some level of confidence that any facilities that were constructed would be utilized. If that can be accomplished via feasibility study, then that would be good. I guess depending on the types of projects that we come up with and what we choose to advance, I would think that the feasibility of their use would be one of the criteria on which we choose to advance a project. If we get down to the end of the day and north and south recreational parking rises to the top of the list, or the component of those on the top of the list, and I think we certainly would need to have that discussion further.
Okay. Yeah, and to Jalen's point, anything that's been approached, in the hotspot process as a concept. Previously, UDOT was not to speak for you, Monty, but was not interested in spending these monies for studies. And for instance, the bypass that we looked into, and some of the decision lens processes. And so it's hard to see us move forward with a public transit, system for the hotspot process that doesn't require studies. And again, with the time sensitivity, it just seems like we're getting to a place where everyone is hopefully comfortable with committing to public transit through including that in the design of other projects. But we'll get to the decision making later in the meeting. Are there any other comments on this topic before we go back to Zachariah for his agenda item? Okay, seeing none, we'll go back to item 4, presentation of the shared use path, conceptual design and next steps by Zachariah Levine. Zachariah.
Wow, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Wes did raise his hand, I believe.
Oh, I'm sorry, Wes. I didn't see that. Go ahead, Wes.
No problem. I just wanted to kind of expand on that. It seems like we could maybe, if we keep it simple to start out with the transit, it seems like we could integrate some of that into the Main Street improvements. Maybe just earmarking some projects, off Main Street, on the side streets, and having just set aside some kind of future use for transit, because it seems like that's what's going to end up happening is, you're going to have stops for people to jump on. And it seems like it'd be pretty simple just to set aside some corners, if we have kind of a preliminary plan. So that's just my 2 cents.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Wes.
Yeah, forgive me, Curtis. One more. So Wes, you raised an interesting point. I just remember when we were in, my wife and I were in, I don't know, Ecuador, wherever it was, down south. They had a cross between a taxi and a bus system, and there's a word in Spanish for it now. I've forgotten what it is, but I remember we rode it extensively across town, and you could get on, and they kind of have a prescribed route through town, much like our proposed shuttle system might go up and down the highway or up and down Spanish Valley Road. But if you got on, you said, and the driver says, well, where do you want to go? And you might say, well, I want to go to the MRAC, to the swimming pool. He would take you out there. It wasn't too far out of the ordinary route that he would take. So that was a great beauty in that. And I remember it wasn't terribly expensive to ride either. So that's maybe something along the lines of what you were talking about, Wes.
Mr. Chair, can I just add a couple of things real quick? As people are thinking about transit and these other projects as we get into it, I just wanted to make sure we have some information that might help you deliberate is part of it, which is, and I don't want to speak for Monty, I feel like he can jump on and give UDOT's perspective. Firstly, the direction we've gotten from UDOT thus far is if we're interested in pursuing transit of any size or shape, what they will need in order to move forward, UDOT will need to move forward to help us evaluate this as a feasible alternative or a feasible project, is a commitment of money over about 10 years. So whether it's we're looking at $750,000, $500,000, $100,000, there will need to be some action by our community to commit to that financing plan. So it's whether it's the city saying we've guaranteed this amount for the next 10 years, or the county does that. So it sounds like they want to make sure it's cost feasible before we even try to understand whether it's feasible from a planning perspective. And I don't mean to, I think Monty has sent emails to this effect. So I want to make sure everyone was operating or had gotten that insight. And maybe Monty also will want to speak to if there is a transit alternative, if they have preferences about scope, if they're interested in something like an Uber, that a small Uber, if they're looking for something in greater size, because ultimately we are giving input to UDOT, but UDOT is making the decision about what to recommend to the Transportation Commission. So they whatever transit scope they're in. So I think, Monty, I hope you know, we're definitely looking for that kind of insight and an understanding of what level of information and sophistication you would need in order for a transit proposal to be acceptable. If you need a study, if you would just generally a concept, what should we be developing for you by September?
So, Carly, yes, you're right that we would be looking for the financial commitment to operate the system for 10 years, and that is a similar commitment as what's being required in Washington County for the recreational hotspot funding effort they have ongoing there. As far as what we need to be able to move forward, as I mentioned in our last meeting, would be a concept, a well-defined concept, and a concept level estimate in order to satisfy the requirements of what we're looking at for September 1st. The design time could extend beyond that. Obviously, you complete your concepting process and then make a decision and then move from concept into design. And so I think those are the two criteria. And as far as whether a reduced type of transit system, a shuttle type system, I believe the ability to put a concept together for that and to have a concept estimate is doable within the time frame between now and September 1st if the committee decides that's the direction they want to go. The actual specific design can happen post September 1st, but we need to have concept level estimates and a commitment in place that would require a commitment from the governmental entities of, Grand County and Moab City, if it's a combined effort, or from one or the other, committing to that financial obligation.
Thank you. That's so helpful.
Okay, do we have any other comments on this issue?
So I just to be clear, so that like the specific design concepts that would come from the county or the city, is that correct, Monty?
Once we get to a project that we are proposing to move forward and the concept is approved by the Transportation Commission, the design cost would be absorbed as part of the project costs. Those would not need to be, the design costs will not be at the cost of the city or the county. That is part of delivering a recreational hotspot project, is doing the design for that project. Does that answer your question specifically, Karen?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess the concern would be, I mean, I think that what would stop us completely, right here with both councils is that, we have, especially with COVID, we are down to, zero funding. So, the concern is if we were having to try to come up with that design concept specs for that, we'd be saying no immediately, because there's, we don't have the funds to even do that at this point. So I guess it was just, trying to clarify if that would be, efforts from UDOT, that you would be able to help out through that hotspot funding or not. So
For a design, I think, as far as Chairman Wells was correct in saying that these funds are not intended to do a lot of studies. These funds are intended to go towards building projects. And as far as the concept, UDOT has outlaid a considerable amount of money in concepting in the first process. We hired Jones and the Mill to come up with concept and concept level estimates to the tune of about $137,000, in addition to some other design work that's gone on. And so, yeah, my thoughts are that we would probably be able to, with, I don't know if city engineering staff, if they have the ability, we've had a little bit of this discussion previously, that potentially that staff may be able to help with that. UDOT certainly can participate in providing technical expertise and contribute to that. Right now, I have a hard time saying that UDOT wants to go out and hire a consultant to develop a bunch of concepts when we've already done that effort, and without confidence that that project will be delivered.
okay, thank you very much. That's clear.
Any other comments on this before we move back?
I'll try to keep this real short. I mean, this is a problem, Karen. That's a good point. And it's for the county too. I mean, we're all broke at this point. All right. I mean, I know the city certainly is. We don't have a lot of money for that. So I would, regardless of which one of these alternatives that we suggest, I ask rhetorically, are there anything in this list that we could build that does not have a commitment to operation and maintenance cost that we can afford?
Well, I think that's probably something we would get into down the agenda when we get into the project list. But that's a good point, Councilmember Duncan.
Chair, as we know, this last year, TRT funds were voted. I'm sorry. So TRT, we can use TRT funds for transportation now, as of this last year. Is that correct? And does that have to be? How does that? Would we have to vote on that as councils to use that?
The county would have to basically budget for that. But I have to ask you a question. Are we still trying to determine if I want to separate conversation related to public transit that's outside of the hotspot process, or as a committee member of this committee, are we still trying to determine if we want to pursue a public transit specific project? Because if we want to continue to talk about, my recommendation is we need to create a space for that, so that we can really drill down into that. But up front, we need to graduate and make a decision to include public transit as a design. I guess that's what we're looking for with this specific agenda item. So, but to answer your question, that would just be a budget decision made by the county council, or a budget made by the city council if they wanted to budget funds for that, which lends itself to this idea that we need more time to talk through this and plan through that.
Yeah, I agree.
Do we have any other comments?
Are we still talking about transit?
We are still on item 5. We
Okay.
move past item 4. So if
Okay.
we don't have any more comments on transit, do you have a comment for transit, Zachariah?
Sure, and perhaps it can be a segue to the next item. But I'm getting the sense that folks are all in agreement that the transit conversation is a bigger bite than we are capable of taking on right now. But I will just remind everyone that I have been in communication with Tim Boschert, who is the transit program manager for UDOT, about the use of federal 5304 funds to conduct the transit study that would serve as the roadmap for developing and implementing a transit system. It's more in line with the scale that I think Mike and Karen have been discussing in this call and previous calls. It's $100,000 study that we are estimating. The federal 5304 fund is an 80-20 match. UDOT, in their continued support for our area, has at least verbally pledged to contribute to the local match requirement. So if that's $20,000, we have basically been discussing a shared match of $5,000 each from UDOT, the city, the county, and because you can't use federal dollars to match federal dollars, the Friends of Arches and Canyonlands National Parks has verbally pledged to contribute $5,000 on behalf of the National Park Service. So in the 3-phase planning process that I've laid out for both councils, going from regional transportation planning to a unified city-county transportation plan to a transit plan, that is teed up to happen at some point in the next year and a half or so. There's nothing that would prohibit us from accelerating the schedule of applying for and putting to work those federal 5304 funds. The primary limitation is staff capacity. So if there is additional capacity within the city and county organizations and partners, then it is possible to accelerate that further. But I think it's just too much for our limited staff to be working simultaneously on 3 major transportation planning efforts in addition to this Arches Hotspot committee. So that is why it's kind of phased third. But I just want to remind everyone that it's not lost, even if it's not part of the Arches Hotspot allocation.
Yeah, so again, if we could huddle as a city and a county to to delve into the challenges, and opportunities, I think it'd be, and maybe it's just this presentation of his 3-phase plan so that we can better understand what those individual phases look. But I'm going to ask one more time if we have any other comments on item 5. All right, seeing none, we'll go back to item 4, which is the president design and next steps. Zachariah, go ahead.
Sure. So I am going to share my screen here, and I apologize for being late to the meeting. I was on time, but having computer troubles. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. Let me make sure it is working here. Okay, Can you all see this? Okay, so what I have taken you to here is a publicly available website. It is a story map that my office put together as a way to present this project to the public. We started working on the concept of developing a shared multi-use pathway along Spanish Valley Drive from the intersection of Mill Creek Drive and Spanish Valley Drive out to frankly, Ken's Lake turnoff, which extends into San Juan County. We weren't the first to conceive of this project, but in recent years, we were very much the first to commit county and public staff resources to moving this project forward. You can access this story map on our department's webpage, and I can also follow up this meeting with links and some additional attachments that I will be going through. Like many story maps, it is set up so that it's got maps and figures and text that go along with them. So I'm not going to run through this entire story map now. The basic concept is to develop a shared multi-use pathway from the intersection of Mill Creek and Spanish Valley Drive as far south as we can get it. It's 5.5 miles from that Mill Creek Spanish Valley Drive intersection to the county line. It's another 2 miles to the Ken's Lake turnoff. Because there was some discussion in the last meeting about extending or using the Arches Hotspot money only for building the pathway out to what would be a reasonable point south in the valley to provide alternative transportation options. Going out to, let's call it Kirby Lane, that is about 3.5 miles. So you can keep that in mind in terms of how it would adjust the project costs should money be allocated for this, but not to build the entire corridor out. I've chosen Kirby Lane because that is about as far south as the majority of our higher density residential development extends at this point, and that's entitled, not necessarily fully constructed residential development. I'll come back to the reasons why I think this project checks all of the boxes of the hotspot legislation, being congestion mitigation, recreation development, and economic development. But walking through this, the story map provides a lot of justification for why this active transportation infrastructure is really the next critical element of a larger active transportation network in Grand County. I realize I'm scrolling through this very quickly. It's just to give you kind of a first glance at this story at this website if you haven't seen it yet. Here we've detailed the different types of paths. So one thing we knew going into it was that a best case scenario would be a separated pathway over here in the top left corner of my screen through the entire corridor. But given potential topographical constraints and land ownership constraints, we knew that might not be possible throughout the entire corridor. And so we've presented alternative pathway designs in the event that we just couldn't actually develop this ideal pathway cross section in some areas. And so we kind of went into it saying, well, if a separated pathway is our best case scenario throughout, there may just be some segments where we have to settle for the best that we can get in order to maximize safety and usability. So again, we've got some alternative designs in here so you can explore all of this, and then there's opportunity to provide feedback. So once again, I will send this link to everyone so you can explore that site on your own. But we have moved quite a bit from the point of presenting this story map and the initial concept to the public. We held 2 open houses. We've solicited public feedback. We've got an information packet that we have available for landowners that might be affected by this. We have also contracted with Jones and DeMille Engineering to move forward with survey and design work. And I wouldn't say that we're at 30% design for the pathway, but we're somewhere between conceptual design and 30% engineering design. I'm going to change the shared screen that I'm showing and actually move you into some of the technical information that I can provide. Let's see here. So here's a more technical presentation of the shared use pathway design. We are requiring that developers along Spanish Valley Drive begin to dedicate right-of-way to accommodate this pathway. That's part of the standard right-of-way dedication process as folks develop. So this is essentially moved all the way to the outside of the standard right-of-way width that Grand County requires. It's all on the west side of Spanish Valley Drive. We are also requiring developers to begin bonding for this. So the standard protocol for land development is that if you have to make offsite improvements in order to bring a roadway up to the standards that are called for in your transportation master plan, that is incumbent upon the developer to construct those improvements or bond for them. We have been asking for folks to do one of those, or to choose one of those strategies. So that will factor into the cost associated with this project if we don't reimburse the developers who are already, beginning to be on the hook for their frontage portion of this road. So a few developments that come to mind that are already on the hook for this include the Arroyo Crossing development, which is a 300 unit housing development, the Sundance or Sandstone Cottages, Sundance Village, sorry, that's a 40 lot subdivision, HDHO subdivision, and then the Peakview subdivision, which is 127 lot subdivision. So those 3 in particular, there are a handful of others, but those are the largest. They are already on the hook for this and planning for it. So, it is a reality. This is probably the most shovel-ready project we have in the mix, I would guess. Again, I'll share all of these documents, and I'm going to move on to the cost estimation table. Okay, so we do have a pretty good cost estimate of what this project will run if constructed. Well, it's too late now, but in 2019 versus 2021, obviously there are some inflation factors and construction cost index factors in there that drive the price up the longer you wait. So the total project cost for that 5.5 mile section is 4.2 million. Let's say that does not account for the few $100,000 of the project cost that is already being covered by developers. Now, we have indicated that if we can get grant money or really favorable loan terms on a loan for the entire project, that it is our goal to pay back the developers who are bonding for or constructing for their segments. It's not a requirement, but I think that it's only reasonable that if we can cover the full cost of the project, that we reimburse those folks for their disproportionate burden of paying for it. If you don't want to stick with this total project cost, and that's because you're changing the length of the corridor that you'd be building, you can also just use this $150 to $153 per linear foot cost. And that's how we give developers, that's how they estimate what their bonding limit or what their bonding levels are for their street frontage. So 150, let's call it $153 a square or a linear foot. This includes a little bit of money for right-of-way acquisition. It's not a ton of money for right-of-way acquisition, and that's because turns out that in the design, we don't have to purchase as much right-of-way as I was expecting at the outset of this process. Can you all see that I shifted to a different spreadsheet? Or are you still looking at the project cost?
Still looking at project costs.
Okay. So real quickly, this table shows, actually the limited amount of right-of-way that we need to purchase. It's, I think it's like roughly a half acre or an acre of land that we would need to purchase, and that would be it. Now that is to construct the ideal pathway, which would have a buffer zone between the travel lane and the path. If you reduce some of the areas where you have buffer and you just have a protective barrier, that reduces the amount of right-of-way acquisition even further. We do have a list of landowners in San Juan County that would be affected. We have not communicated with them at all yet. And in fact, I don't want to give folks too much certainty about the right-of-way acquisition yet, because we're still in the process of setting up meetings with the landowners that where right-of-way would be needed.
Excuse me, Zachariah.
It's not much.
Zachariah, is there any showstoppers in terms of refusal by landowners to grant a right-of-way access for sale, or would there be any kind of condemnation or that might be involved?
Well, I don't want to speak to the legal ramifications of trying to use eminent domain for roadway improvements. It would have to be a function of the way that this project was framed. You cannot use eminent domain for trails, but this, in my opinion, is more of a modern transportation project. Again, that's really a question for our lawyers to dig into a little bit further, but suffice it to say that I am not at all concerned about the feasibility of building this based on right-of-way limitations. Like I said, if we run into a circumstance where a landowner, simply refuses to negotiate, or we can't negotiate to a purchase price, then we can modify the design of the pathway to accommodate the restrictions, the right-of-way width restrictions. So what I'm referring to is like moving from a separated pathway to a side path with a Jersey barricade or something like that, and then going back out to a separated path as needed.
Okay, thank you.
Zachariah, I'm just curious, like how, I mean, being an avid cyclist myself and knowing that it's close to 1,000 feet of climbing to get up towards Ken's Lake, how many people really are going to use that? Are you thinking this is going to be people coming into work? I mean, is this going to be lighted? Are you allowing e-bikes? I mean, we
Yeah,
can't even.
so those are all great questions. In my opinion, to truly view this as a commuter pathway, it would have to be developed to accommodate e-bikes, and that is the stance that we have taken from the get-go. That is why the AASHTO standards that have been used to design the pathway are those that can accommodate e-bikes. So maybe that's a great segue to the sort of my last point on this project, which is, how does this meet the legislative intent of the hotspot funding? And, I would say first and foremost, if we are serious about congestion mitigation, we are going to have to figure out a way to limit or reduce the number of vehicle trips into our commercial business district. The city and the county together have nearly 1,000 residential units entitled right now that are not yet constructed. And virtually all of those are in the southern portion of Spanish Valley, or at least south of city limits or the downtown core. As we see more and more of that residential development come online, we're going to have to figure out a way to keep people out of their cars for either single occupancy vehicle trips or even just individual trips with multiple occupants. I would say, in the recreation segment of the hotspot funding, there are obvious benefits, right? So that's recreation value, not just for residents, but also tourists. I don't know how many cycling events, road cycling events that would open up by having direct access to the LaSalle Loop Road that has been repaved and will continue to be improved. If you go from city limits up into the LaSalles and then back to town on SR 128, I think that's what, 120 miles or something, 100 miles, maybe it's less than that. Maybe it's only like 60 or 70, but nevertheless,
I'm sorry.
yeah, like from the city up on the Loop Road, down Castle Valley onto 128.
62 miles.
50?
62.
62, okay. So there's obvious recreational value. In terms of economic development, I can share with you all several documents I've put together illustrating the economic value of cycling and mountain biking. There are, just an incredible number of academic studies correlating place attachment and quality of life metrics and property values and tax revenue with the existence of proximal bike paths. So I think that there's a very strong economic development argument there in terms of continuing to highlight Moab as an amenity-rich community. And if we're talking about diversification and attracting and retaining talent, these are the types of amenities that people expect. So I do think that there's a strong congestion mitigation argument as well. And I talked a little bit about that earlier. I think it could be fleshed out a little bit more with more concrete data, but I'm confident that it checks all three of the hotspot boxes. And I do actually really like Council Member Jones's recommendation that as a way to stretch the hotspot dollars further, build the trail out to, sort of the furthest south, higher density residential development. And then we find a different pot of money to complete the pathway, at another time.
Thank you, Zachariah. Before we comment on that as a committee, I would like to first give Monty or other UDOT staff the opportunity to comment on the presentation. And in particular, I think what we're looking for is how this project fits within the program criteria.
Right. Thank you for that presentation, Zachariah. There would definitely, I can see how it does check the boxes in the categories. The degree is to what, or I guess the question is to what degree it checks those boxes. Depending, I think there's definitely would need to be some discussion. I believe there would be many people that would say, maybe not. And there may be an equal number of people that would say, yes, I think that does. Honestly, I believe it will take some internal discussion at UDOT to determine whether or not this achieves the intent of the funding. I don't think it's a grand slam home run as far as meeting the intent, but I do see portions of this that do get there. If there was any way that we could quantify some of that congestion, some of those reduced trips, those reduced vehicle trips into the downtown business district, that would be great to have that information. I think everybody is aware that UDOT and active transportation is a good focus for UDOT, and we are very interested in that. So I can make the argument. To be honest with you, I can see it, and I can make an argument on both sides of that equation. And I'm just being very honest with you about what I believe the perspective of this will be.
Monty, if this project is included in the box of 4 projects that we're looking to leave the meeting with today, what degree of heartburn is that going to cause up front? Are you guys okay with us if we decided to move forward this and then evaluate that as we go?
Yeah, I would like to be quite frank. I'd like to see this in the box. I don't have a problem with it being in the box. Okay. I think there, like I said, I believe there's some that will kind of look at me and say, really? You think that meets the criteria? And then others will say, absolutely, that meets the criteria. So okay. I think this is a type of project that we should be evaluating.
Okay, thank you for that.
For what it's worth, from my perspective, I think a strategic approach to this is not necessarily to lead with this project, but to present it as part of a larger package of projects. Obviously, this project alone is not going to use up all $10 million. So, it's a function of how well it complements the other, 1, 2, or 3 projects that they get presented.
I want to make a comment there real quick, because I think I tried to address it in our first meeting, and I want to make it clear in this one that yes, there was approximately 10 million. It was actually a little over 10 million when you considered the concepting dollars that were awarded based on the project concepts that were developed in the first iteration. So what we're doing here is we got to recognize we don't have a $10 million grant that is going to the Arches hotspot, recreational hotspot. What we have is the opportunity to define projects and take those to the commission to determine the amount of funding that they will allocate to the projects. So just throwing out a number, if we came up with a project that was a $6 million cost, we took it to the commission and they approved it, then we would receive $6 million. If we came up with one, that was, I would say we have the opportunity to potentially go up to what the original amount was less what's been spent to date. But I don't want it to sound like this is a grant that we're going to take, every dollar of what was left over from the original allocation, and that's what we have to spend on a menu of projects. I think that's important for us all to understand, that we do have the opportunity to address good projects, but it's not an opportunity to say, okay, we can spend $10 million. What are we going to spend it on?
Yeah, question for you. Now, so question is, previously we presented 2 different requests for of downtown parking structure and Main Street improvements. Is that correct?
And actually, there was actually 3. And so
Three,
the way
dispersed parking.
that's correct. The dispersed parking, the downtown parking structure, and the Main Street improvements. And as I mentioned in the previous meeting, the Main Street improvements were related to and tied to parking, because most Main Street improvements will have an effect on parking. It's pretty difficult to do Main Street improvements without having any effect on parking. And so there was an understanding that they need to be linked somehow to allow for that. As we went through the funding, so those 3 were identified at just a blanket $10 million, and it was up to UDOT to determine the allocation based on the estimates for the for the parking structure. We put that in a separate project, and then we put $1.7 million into dispersed parking, with any leftover funds from either the dispersed parking or the parking structure would then be able to be spent on Main Street improvements. And so that's the way that unfolded. And there is, I think as we go through and consider projects, we need to, and Main Street improvements, if those still stay on the menu, then we ought to be looking at how we're going to also look to see if there's impacts to parking. Is there going to be a mitigation for that?
Okay.
That's just thinking out loud as we start working about what's in the box.
Okay. So essentially you're wanting us to not assume that the design cost for the parking structure is what's on the table right now.
I think we can operate under the desire to have the full allocation of the residual money, but it's the merit of those projects
Okay.
going forward that will determine the final amount of money allocated.
That's clear. Is that clear? Crystal clear to me. Okay. Okay. Committee members, do you have any Zachariah and the multi-use pathway presentation we just received?
Yeah, I have one question for
Go
Zachariah.
ahead.
It seems like you've had a certain level of public engagement with this process. Is that true, or am I remembering things that didn't happen?
No, that's definitely true. We have held 2 public open houses. We have discussed it in a number of planning commission meetings. We have met with individual stakeholders. We have had a steering committee that has sort of unofficially reached out to various sort of representatives of different stakeholder groups. So I think that we've definitely laid the groundwork for the project in a outward facing sense.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Zachariah or UDOT? Yeah, Councilmember Cole.
Yeah, coming in late, I haven't seen a lot of the discussions about a south end parking. I think somebody had mentioned Spanish Trail Arena, but in terms of the pathway and connectivity to some of these other kind of regional transportation hubs, possible future shuttle stops, I was curious if there was other zones that may be serviced besides besides just the housing. That makes sense? I guess it's a question for Zachariah about how the pathway project might tie in with some of these other congestion mitigation projects.
So if you're talking about a southern parking lot like near the old Spanish Trail Arena, then there's an obvious connection point because there's Grand County land and a Grand County easement that could connect the two. While we have been focused on the primary corridor pathway on Spanish Valley Drive, we also acknowledge that, the next phases of developing the active transportation network has to include more east-west connectors. So, we're thinking Spanish Trail Road would be an obvious connection going over to Murphy Lane, and then ultimately tying in the development on the west side of Highway 191, where the future USU Moab site or campus is going to exist. That's an important component of building out the active transportation network. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, has there been any talk of any kind of like possible future trailhead or access to the pathway in that northern zone by the Mill Creek intersection or the future campus site in the design process?
Right. Yeah. So we have initiated a conversation with Chuck about the connection there at the intersection over to where the city's bike path picks up. And we've got some initial ideas for that, but that's certainly a piece of this.
Okay.
That needs to be finalized.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about ways to, kind of make it so it's not just so much of a standalone kind of thing, but that it can tie in with some of these other things that we're hoping to put in the box as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could think of it as like, the spinal cord, and you need a lot of ribs coming off of it.
Yeah.
But it's certainly the backbone for that southern stretch of the valley.
Great.
Good. Yeah. Are there any Zachariah or UDOT staff as it pertains to the multi-use pathway? Okay. Seeing none, I'm going to move us on to the bulk of what we're trying to accomplish in this meeting, and that 6, which is project identification and selection of projects to be evaluated for hotspot funding. So the way we'd like to do this through the list, which there's a link to in the agenda itself, give a very brief overview of each project. When we get to in the spreadsheet that is titled maintenance, and additionally in this item, Councilmember Kalen Jones has included improvement concepts PDF that I would like to give him the opportunity to review with the group before we actually vote on our projects. The way I would like to do this once we start to vote on projects is if you could pick your top 4 projects with in order of preference. So number 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we can review those and staff can deliver basically what's in the box to UDOT. Now we are looking for some feedback from UDOT, as we deliberate on these projects. Good way for the sake of time is if there's anything that gives you guys a lot of heartburn, or if there's anything similar to your feedback on the multi-use pathway that you think is interesting that you would like to see evaluated further, that is helpful for us because, as I mentioned before, we really want to process, make sure that we're in lockstep as we move forward. So with that being said, I'll start us off. Is everybody looking at that project list? Yeah. Okay, so number 1 is dispersed parking. You'll see the original scope, which is what was proposed for dispersed previously. You'll see the original budget. What we want you to be looking at is the proposed new scope. So what we're referring to as dispersed parking and the new scope is the popular off Main Street parking. So what we're referring to there is if you're looking at the downtown core as a grid, 100 north, 100 to 100 south on both sides of Main Street. That people would like to see that development on the east side of Main Street, but also some on the west side. Thinking about a good way to visualize this is the parking and the median and the design of what's currently in front of City Hall on Center Street. That's the inspiration. Obviously, it doesn't have to look like that, but that's something that we've heard a lot from the public that's gained steam as we've moved forward. So basically parking on the off streets, with some potential redevelopment and then also that's a good example of where like that public transit design can. The next item is Main Street improvements. The new concepts under the proposed new scope urban design improvements, pedestrian mall concept, metered parking, keeping Main Street parking, side street parking, pedestrian bulb outs at intersections, economic development, more attractive and pedestrian friendly environment, comfort, crowding during queue, including social distancing, traffic calming, locate push button activators so bikers can reach from curb, time limit signage, economic development supports parking availability for customers. Study indicated that meters not warranted at this time. So also that as we move to the box, these things can be tailored. So some specific inclusions in that scope, could be trimmed out or, amended slightly, but it's there to give you just an idea. Staff, Carly and Zachariah, am I confusing referring to the off Main Street parking? Are we kind of together? Because I'm seeing references to that in both of them.
I got comments for both of those. So it might mean like be spilling into both. And I think you were right that the details definitely matter when you're considering it. I don't want to say don't worry about the details, but when it comes to what I would encourage you to do is when it comes to selecting the projects, say the details are going to be worked out when we drill down on each project. So yeah, concept is what you should be thinking of generally. And whether it's off, what the parking is doing, sometimes that will be worked out, hopefully as we narrow in.
Okay, so I think that's fine. The next project on the list is parking. Consider transit shuttle connection to serve the lots. So recreation parking for like a, original description is parking for trucks and trailers that is lighted and has security cameras. The lot would be around 2 acres, fit around 100 regular trailers and 50 large, and be located off SR 191 toward the north end of town. So what that's evolved to is that in addition to design it to consider future transit amenability. The south recreation parking, same concept, but south of town. The shared use path, which we just received a presentation from Zachariah on. He does have a cost estimate in there of 4.25 million. Shuttle transit, which we did. Obviously I shared my thoughts on how we could, best work through this as a group for the sake of time and process and with UDOT. But, it's very limited of what we know about shuttle transit feasibility. If you're voting for that, you're essentially taking a leap of faith. The next is active traffic management. Eliminate center lane as turn lane and allocate to either north and south via dynamic lane reversal. Dynamically optimize traffic signals for progression of most congested direction. Dynamically adjust speed limits north and south of town when to destination. Just as fast and slower travel on congested undivided highway will improve safety. When I get to the bottom of the list, we'll ask for any follow-up questions before we jump into ranking, by the way. Bike share program, future bike sharing, e-bikes, other active transportation. We have a cost estimate of $500,000. The bypass corridor, we don't need to get into that. Cane Creek Boulevard, reconceptualized as part of Main Street alternates, scope changes to beginning at 500 West and then east to US 191. I'm thinking Kalen, may touch on that also. Main Street alternates, reduce congestion, mini Lee paving, 100 West roundabout, 100 West construction, develop bypass candidates rejected in previous study, but which in fact can reduce Main Street traffic, and which will be used as such and are bearing that impact, since phone mapping apps already guide people from arterials to local and feeders during times of congestion. The Stewart Canyon drainage, which was mentioned previously. The west parking structure design costs. So if you look in the new scope, we're talking about forwarding the design cost coverage, which is $300,000. Not the project itself. East parking structure is not included and expansion is not included. So why don't we do this? Kalen, I'm going to give you the opportunity to take the group through your PDF and your additions to the list and the things that you would like to pitch to the group. And then we'll get some quick follow-up from the group on those specific projects. We'll ask the committee if they have any additional questions on the list itself. And then we'll go into the project ranking. Does that sound good to everyone?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, with one addition. After Kalen does his thing, much in the same fashion that Monty expounded on the acceptability to Utah of the South bike share stuff, maybe Monty could comment on each and all of the little things on there in terms of his impression of UDOT acceptability there, because he's already expressed some of those reservations, and then we would be ready to vote.
Yeah, I think that's good procedure. Appreciate that, Councilmember Duncan. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Councilmember Jones.
Thank you, Chairman Wells. So yesterday I spent some time working on what Main Street improvements might look like based on the conversations I've had with some of you, feedback we've received, and documents that have already been done. So I think those kind of speak for themselves. Today I was working on, after talking to a couple of you, about the need to scale down this list of projects. So I'm going to share some other things with you just to frame this conversation. And I will start. I shared this document with you, the spreadsheet. I've shared this with all of you. It's a list of 5, not 4 projects, totaling 99.7 million. I've lumped downtown improvements together. I feel like one of the questions that I asked, which I'd like to hear from UDOT eventually, is some small projects may only address one of the hotspot criteria and others may address another better. But as a package, they are cumulatively a reasonable spend, and collectively, I think they offer a lot of benefit to downtown. And that includes both supporting like traditional on-street, like street development downtown with Emma and 100 West, as well as the downtown pedestrian and bike improvements. The Spanish Valley Path, I think that's most, if not all of us, hope that will make it into the final package and be funded. Dispersed parking is a relatively minor spend, and recreation parking, I think that has potential, and we should at least, I hope we can at least continue to evaluate its viability after today. And then the Cane Creek Boulevard improvements, my understanding is that both the city and the county have applied for FLAP grants for our respective portions, and that we're going to find out about whether or not either of those were awarded in mid-May. So I think the county's portion may be a little more likely than the city's, but in any event, this is an important recreational access corridor as well as a Main Street alternate. And so I'd like to at least keep them in the queue till we find out about the FLAP funding. So with that, I will switch to a different chair. Sorry. So just to elaborate a little bit more, these are all the hotspot bypass concepts that were on the table at the beginning of the bypass discussion. So obviously a lot of them really aren't bypasses and impact neighborhoods, but nevertheless, we end up using them to, and visitors do, during times of high congestion. And this is what a visitor's phone can look like. You've probably all had the experience of being led around on surface streets by your mapping app to save a minute. And that happens in Moab too, on Cane Creek. So there's a series of projects on 100 West, which could also support access to 100 West as it develops. There's a lot of radically underdeveloped commercial land there that could really be a vibrant place and is likely to draw future visitors. But currently they drive into downtown to get there, and we could get them off Main long before they get down into the zone of many streetlights and pedestrians. So this is an access off Emma, which is in the works, but the city could use funding to help with it. There's also dispersed parking up there that is still in development. This is the 400 North, 100 West intersection. I had put this roundabout on the list as possibly being funded, but I've since learned it is fully funded already. So I've taken that out of the budget. And then there's 1,000 feet of 100 West that is a 90% design, which could complete this project. And here is a very detailed budget, which I won't bore you with since it's not directly germane to figuring this all out. So I feel like this is a really good package of projects which could address all the hotspot criteria. They're all potentially fundable, and it also eliminates a lot of the ones that I think we don't need to consider anymore. Transit was at the top of the list, as Curtis suggested, not as a funded project, but as a consideration for incorporating into design of all of them. So, Chairman, that's what I have.
Okay. Are there any follow-up questions on any of the specific projects? Go ahead, Kayleen, finish.
And I should add that our city engineer, Chuck Williams, is in the waiting room and is available to answer questions.
Okay. Do we have any follow-up questions from the committee on those specific projects for Kayleen or Chuck Williams?
So Kayla, let me make sure I'm perfectly clear about this. So on your Main Street improvements then, you are going to, as UDOT originally suggested, replace the on Main Street parking with bike lanes, is that correct?
No, my understanding is that that is not, that was part of what, that suggestion was part of what stimulated this whole pullback from the parking structure. So what I had suggested is that we look at the as yet to be approved downtown plan proposal, which is bulb outs at the intersections, some mid-street bulb outs. And in addition to pedestrian safety, this provides planters and areas for bike parking. I feel like bike parking downtown is almost more important than bike paths because it's easy to get from the side streets mid-block, but then you end up chaining your bike to a tree or to a bike rack that's already in our narrow sidewalks. One of the questions that I have for UDOT, because of their concern about friction, is would these bulb outs reduce speeds below what the speed limit is? Or because it seems like that's the critical thing. We want people to drive at or below the speed limit and not above. And we don't want people running red lights. And so if traffic calming just gets them to do that, it seems like that's going to be a win down there. And I'm not sure that the bulb outs as were proposed in the downtown plan would actually slow people below the speed limit.
Okay, well, thank you. One more easy question for you. If I understand you correctly, then with narrower medians on Main Street, but no left turn lanes that would occupy what used to be the center lane that is now gone. So if you're traffic coming south, for example, and you want to make a left-hand turn on Center Street, for example, you would have to block the left-hand southbound lane in order to make that left-hand turn. Is that correct?
My understanding of it as proposed is that left turns wouldn't be allowed. And so that would reduce friction, but it would obviously be less convenient. So I think that's a detail that we need to discuss more at a future meeting and with UDOT and with the engineers, because I'm not sure what the best solution is in that regard, but I still feel like the whole package of Main Street and downtown improvements as a whole, I think we should continue to work through it and develop it in a way that works for UDOT as well as for the Main Street businesses.
Okay, thank you.
Carly, just clarification so everyone's clear. What Kaylin's referring to is in the project list spreadsheet under the title Main Street Alternates, correct? Okay.
That's my understanding, yeah.
Okay.
And
Are
then,
there any?
well, and then, Keelan, I believe you did have some, there's the alternates and there's also, he had some concept about Main Street improvements too, but I did not delineate the bulk of what is in that proposed new scope ideas was in Main Street improvements too. And also
Okay.
He contributed to the Main Street alternate concept.
With everyone, we'll include what Kaylin Jones Councilmember Jones has presented in Main Street improvements. That's to just be included in that scope. So if you vote for Main Street improvements, that'll include all the recommendations. And then as we move forward in evaluating, it can be trimmed down and tailored, if needed or if desired. So are there any other questions, follow-up questions for Councilmember Jones or Chuck Williams before we move on to the projects, voting on the projects?
Yes.
Councilmember
I apologize. Yeah, thank you. For some reason, my computer keeps completely knocking me off. So I may have missed this, but answer the question again. So for Kaylin's project list and for the purposes of voting, Main Street improvements are to include the Main Street alternates?
No,
Okay,
no, he's got Main Street alternates as a standalone.
okay,
And then he's also recommended some improvements that for purposes of voting will include with that item. And maybe it would be helpful to identify those, which are to be included in the improvements before we vote. Can we do that real quick, Kaylin and Carly?
Sure. So what I had conceptualized as downtown improvements were the Main Street improvements as articulated in the Moab downtown plan, which I just talked about. And I've got that. I could throw that up on the screen if that would help people. I was thinking it would also include an evaluation of the side street parking ideas that we've discussed, like basically taking the in front of Main Street, middle of the road parking idea and seeing where we can apply that closer to Main Street. And then also funding the improvements on Emma and 100 West to help that out and help the downtown access. That's what I'd lump together under downtown improvements in my mind.
Okay, so let's make sure we get this straight because we've got it Main Street improvements right now. And so Kaylin wants to include those items he just mentioned into the Main Street improvements. And is everyone comfortable with doing that? To be determined, at a following meeting of what specifically, we'll work through that as a group is what we want to pursue as Main Street improvements. But is everyone okay with grouping those together?
I hope I understand. Caitlin, it seems there's some Main Street alternates and then Main Street improvements, and it's a hybrid at this point a bit.
Yes, correct.
It's one concept in the downtown plan.
Okay, so we are not including, that's different than what I've been saying, because we already have a Main Street improvements. It's the second item on the project list. And then down the list, we have an item called Main Street alternates. And so what I want to do for the committee is clearly differentiate between those two if needed. And what I heard from Kaylin was there were some items that he discussed that he wanted to have included under the Main Street improvements item, which is second on the list. Does that make sense?
Yes, I had basically taken two. So under Main Street alternates, it lists the sort of Emma Mini Lee paving, 100 West Roundabout and 100 West project. And I take it turns out one of those is already funded. So I pulled that and then taken the under two and lumped them in with downtown improvements.
Kaylin, which one is funded? Is it the roundabout?
Yes.
Okay. And that's from the Safe Route to Schools. Is that how that's funded or something?
No, it's a different program.
Okay.
Okay, so you are wanting to include the Mini Lee paving and the 100 West construct. You want to take that from the Main Street alternates scope and drop that into the Main Street improvement scope, correct?
Right, except I'm calling it downtown improvements because we're talking about side street parking as well. So.
Okay, so that's the second issue is we need to make sure that everyone's, knows what we're referring to there. I want everyone to look at a clean list while we're voting as much as possible.
This is a new, not a totally new concepts, but we're grouping it differently.
Yeah, we're grouping it differently and people don't have the visual references that reflect what we're talking about. And I don't like that. I
can try pulling it up real quick, doing a downtown improvements, and then I can share my screen if that helps. And just. Okay.
Well, is the committee okay? Can we just real quick get a straw poll? Are you guys okay with making that change to the scope of Main Street improvements? We're talking about redefining that project scope to include these recommendations from Kalen, which is the paving of Mini Lee, which is 300,000, and the 100 West construction, which is 1.2 million.
So Chairman, may I give some input real quick prior
Please.
to that, because that may definitely be germane to that discussion. So
Yeah.
the paving of Mini Lee and 100 West, when those two parking areas were being proposed as part of the dispersed parking in our previous effort, and when city staff brought that to us at UDOT, we contemplated that and said, you know what, it was about a $600,000 deal, 300,000 to pave the parking areas, and then approximately another 300,000 to do the paving of what would become a city street on Mini Lee and 100 West. And we said we would be amenable to paving and paying for the parking, but we didn't think it was appropriate to be paving a city street for that purpose. And so that's probably germane to this conversation, because I don't believe our position on that will have changed.
Okay, that is relevant. So, I mean, with that being said, I guess to me, it would make sense to leave the scope of Main Street improvements alone.
Sorry, that is just addressing the repavement of what's currently paved, or kind of opening up that new road to connect to 191.
It was a new road, and actually that access to 191, that was early on in our design of 191. And if you probably recall, the folks from the city, that was in the plans to make that connection, and it was determined that the city did not want that connection, and we removed it from our project on US 191 project. And so that access, we already had it all designed, ready to go. It was pulled by the city, and so that is no longer part of our project.
Yeah, just so you county, excuse me, Monty.
Go ahead, Mike.
Just so you county guys will know, Emma Lane Boulevard, that whole parking lots back here has been a consternation, thorn in the side. It's related to access to businesses on Main Street, and so the area is still a difficult place to negotiate, in my opinion, right now. And so for what that's worth.
Yeah, I guess I don't see how we can go from this reality that's being expressed by UDOT and Councilmember Duncan, and then circling that back into the hotspot process. I'm not connecting
well,
those
if we can
dots.
fund a bike path, I'm not sure, that's out in Spanish Valley, I'm not sure why a city street that reduces congestion on 191 wouldn't be fundable, but so be it. I feel like this ties into sort of the lack of clarity we have on how projects are going to be ultimately ranked. But maybe that's the topic for a future meeting.
Yeah. So Monty, may I ask if you have any further comments on the downtown improvements, and how UDOT would or would not accept them?
On downtown improvements, some of the items on there, the bulb outs, mid-block crossings, things of that nature do give me great concern about what the effects those are on congestion. The discussion on speed limit and what the effect bulb outs would have on those. Bulb outs, currently when you are during the congested times, the average speed is about 19 miles an hour in downtown Moab. I don't believe you don't see the speed limit of 30 miles an hour during during times of low traffic. There already are enough friction elements down there that keep the speed at about 19 miles an hour. We had a good discussion with some of our traffic and safety folks previous this meeting I did, to make sure that I got some input from them. When we talk about Main Street improvements, the median and limiting left turns, that certainly does improve and help with improve capacity and help with congestion. The challenge with bulb outs is, especially the ones at mid-block, is unless they're regulated, then you can create an unregulated crossing, and as folks know, we've had some challenges with unregulated crossings and people, crossing in locations that aren't anticipated. And although at a bulb out that would be more anticipated, it does create a lot of friction. They also create challenges, bulb outs create challenges with, say, recreational vehicles, pickups, pulling trailers and trying to make those right turns and tracking. The trailers tend to track over the bulb outs, which could, pedestrians can have a false sense of security being standing on a bulb out, and yet a trailer can't make the corner without tracking over the bulb out unless those radiuses are designed properly. I mean, there are challenges. So Main Street improvements, as I said in our previous meeting, in general, a category of saying Main Street improvements do create friction and do not reduce congestion. Now, there are some exceptions to that, like we mentioned, the left turn, reducing left turns and having a center median, things of that nature. Combined with that, I don't know, go ahead.
Well, I was just, not to cut you off, Monty, but so much of what we have down in the scope of Main Street improvements is coupled with the dispersed parking item, which is the off Main Street parking. And
Correct.
so we kind of, the way we have this group together, it isn't exactly as straightforward because, for instance, like, I don't know how much support we would get for Main Street improvements without the dispersed parking element of this. So as you go through like bulb outs and the different concerns that you have, standing alone, they individually are going to raise some concerns. But if all of that comes on the heels of parking on off Main Streets, then it's kind of a different equation, I would think, if that makes sense.
It does, and in fact, I hesitated to roll into that, and I appreciate the fact that you did. Is that off street, using the parking that's in front of the ball fields and the city county building as a model, that type of parking, I believe, has merit. It has. I'm very interested to see how that fleshes out, because I think there is a lot of merit to that. How it relates to, and what I was going to say is, I believe as you look at the entirety of those two together, there is the opportunity to find some Main Street improvements that could work, some of that off-street parking that could work, and to evaluate those together would be beneficial. Now, I want to really quick want to address Councilman Jones' question about, can these all be evaluated individually, or does each of them have to have meet all of the criteria? At the end of the day, I'll say the menu or the projects selected have to meet the criteria. And as we go through and evaluate those, I think it would be best that they did meet the criteria individually, but as long as the combination definitely meets criteria, then we certainly can have that discussion. I don't want to sit here today at this early time in the process and kill ideas when we ought to be trying to promote ideas and how to move this forward. And I want to make sure we have good discussion and understanding of how to meet the criteria and for all of us to be successful.
Okay. And I'll ask the question to the committee again. Is there support to lump the Mini Lee paving and the 100 West construction into what we're calling as Main Street improvements? It is downtown, but we're going to continue to call it Main Street improvements for the sake of clarity as we vote.
I guess, forgive me if I got lost in it, but so what, the 100 West construction at 1.2 million, that what it is included in that?
So if I may, given the time, I'm
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to
Caitlin.
just decouple that. I mean, it seems like it'd be more prudent just to decouple it, given what Monty said, and move on to the voting.
Yeah, I would support that. We want to welcome projects to the list. I think as we're trying to package things together, we're running into trouble though. And so is that going, are you comfortable, Caitlin, with that remaining in the Main Street alternates item? Because on our project list, we have Main Street alternates as a specific project. And then within that, we have these recommendation of yours. And we need to decide if we're going to leave them there before we vote.
Well, let's see. So I'm just saying that in my lumping in the spreadsheet that I shared today of downtown improvements and lumping 100 West into that, it seems that given what we now know, that is imprudent. As far as the proposed new scope ideas in Main Street improvements in the list attached to the agenda, I mean, it seems like just leaving those all in, and then we can work it out later.
Okay, so leaving all of those in the Main Street alternates or the Main Street improvements?
Main
Street improvements is what you have on the document.
On the document that's attached to the agenda. I'm comfortable with the Main Street improvements and Main Street alternates as they are listed for voting.
Okay.
I'm not requesting any changes to those.
Okay, now that requires one more level of clarification, because the scope that we have on Main Street improvements in the spreadsheet, which everyone is looking at, does not account for all of these items that are in this document that you've presented. And so
which document? Sorry.
Your Main Street improvement concepts document that you've presented.
Sorry, I just feel like at this point I've just confused everyone, and
we're doing all right. I mean, we're getting there. I think the biggest thing is I'm trying to a little bit in that we have identified Main Street improvements, and we're acknowledging that some of those may be more downtown improvements, but we're referring to that as Main Street improvements, which is the second item on the scope list. And then you presented some suggestions for Main Street improvements that the group has had access to in the agenda, but it's not necessarily included in the project scope list and the spreadsheet that we're looking at. And I don't know how much of it is really in conflict with committee members' desires. And so what I'm looking for to help us out is if anyone has strong feelings for or against including the scope of Kaylin Jones' Main Street improvements list into the scope of the spreadsheet as we vote. Does anyone like that or not like that? That's all we need to hear. Or if you don't have opinions, then fair enough.
Well, if I may, I feel like what's in the proposed new scope ideas of the project list are broad enough that whatever, they basically capture whatever ideas we want to talk about. I mean,
okay.
Yeah,
I'm comfortable with that. And then these other projects and issues you've discussed about are going to remain in the Main Street alternate scope.
Yes.
Okay, that's clear to me. Is that clear as mud to everybody? Okay, let's just run with it. And so Monty, if it's all right, what I would like to do is, instead of having you run down the menu and tell us what looks good and what doesn't, let us do our ranking. And if there's anything in there that gives you major heartburn, feel free to notify us. Was that all right with you, Monty?
Yes.
So we're gonna rank our top 4 projects, number 1 being our favorite, down to 4. We're gonna review those results. We're gonna recite them together as a choir. And then if there are any of those top 4 that are in there that are in the box that you have major reservations about, would you let us know before we adjourn the meeting?
Yes, that sounds good.
Does that sound like good process to everyone?
Could I chime in, Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
I would just, I know that a lot of us have kind of been thinking about a lot of this in terms of, some of these road adjustments, these suggested pathways, and it's kind of like the city might have some pet projects and the county might have some pet projects. And just for sake of discussion, I wouldn't mind hearing from Wes about kind of what he's hearing on Main Street and some of the things that, really going back to square one in this whole process of what may be beneficial to some of those folks that he's here representing.
Yeah, that is a well said, excellent point, and please enlighten us if you wouldn't mind, Wes.
Yeah, been trying to stay in contact with the client, just getting feedback. And like I said before, just dealing with the climate that we're in right now, it's proven to be a little bit difficult getting, 100% feedback on things. People are trying to open up this weekend, including myself, just trying to get everything together. So it is proving a little bit difficult, but I have been getting really good feedback. I think everybody as a whole on Main Street, it just seems like it's been a long time coming for Moab to do a, kind of, I guess you could call a facelift on Main Street and just really try and focus on some uniformity and just bringing everything into focus and trying to make, like Monty brings up, just trying to reduce that friction on Main Street. And I think, parking meters seem to be a problem. People kind of split down the middle with parking meters. Seems like a lot of people are for the timed parking and trying to get all those trailers off Main Street for businesses. And then, just trying to make a better environment on Main Street because it is pretty crazy. And that's kind of where everybody's coming from on Main Street. I don't know if you have specific questions that you want to address on that, but I can answer those if you want.
Wes, I got a question for you. So on the project list, number 1 and 2, we have the dispersed parking, which is now the off Main Street improvements. And then second to that, we have the Main Street improvements that are currently are kind of drafted as a in addition to providing off Main Street parking. Does the Downtown Business Alliance and the businesses downtown, are they pretty unified, in support of off Main Street parking and kind of go in that direction and what's in front of City Hall, or what's the membership? How do they feel about that?
Yeah, I think everybody's on board in that respect. Just utilizing all the space that we have on the side streets off Main Street. Everybody's on board with that. Personally for me, I think if we take that dispersed parking and the Main Street improvements, that's kind of my number 1 project, is combining both of those and trying to make it work, and use that as a goal. That's kind of where I'm at on it.
Yeah, if I may interject a little bit, Carly, you might want to comment on this too. We've been going round and round with dispersed parking, and again, Carly, correct me if I've got this wrong. My understanding is that the negotiations with various landowners for behind buildings and so forth is, I would put it as rather mired in complexities and might be difficult to implement in the kind of time frame that we're talking about. Is that right, Carly?
I think that's a good characterization of it. The negotiations are really difficult for that kind of project. So feasible, definitely in concept, it might rank pretty high, but when we've tried to carry it out, it's been really difficult.
Thank you.
I want to point of clarification, because I think we're also, I guess what I was referring to when we have off Main Street parking, which is, we have defined as parking developed on side streets. So not private property, talking about 100 South, Center, 100 North, on east and west of Main Street.
Yeah, I would just jump in and say that's kind of where I was coming from on the dispersed parking. I mean, I think there needs to be a lot of revision, which I don't think would be hard. It's just focusing on the space that we have and not necessarily on the private land ownership. I mean, I think, again, a can of paint and marching around off the side streets and just marking out spaces, I think we could gain a lot from that. And that's where I'm going with the dispersed parking, like is doing a revision on that and talk about it and have the discussion about it and try and come up with some creative alternatives for that.
Okay. Thanks for that opportunity to clarify that though, Mike. Okay, so let's move into the project ranking process by committee member. And so why don't we'll start with you, Wes Shannon, if you wouldn't mind. Would you give us your top 4 projects from 1 to 4?
Sure. I do number 1, Main Street improvements. Number 2, dispersed parking. And then, yeah, number 3 and number 4 is difficult for me. I mean, I still have a little bit of focus on that recreation parking north and south, but I understand how difficult that is right now. Can I just hold on to those 2, or do I have to have 4?
You don't have to have 4.
I think with these 2 projects, I think we could really soak up a lot of that money, is kind of where I stand with it. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, Council Member Guzman Newton, would you mind sharing your projects 1 through 4?
Do I really have to go next?
You don't have to if you don't
Okay.
want to.
Nope, skip me for a second.
Okay, Council Member Hawks.
Huh.
I don't have to do roll call. If there's someone that's anxious to share, I'm happy to give you the floor. How about that?
No, I'm fine going next. I don't believe, I'll just preface this by saying, I don't believe you can do Main Street improvements without dispersed parking. And when I say dispersed parking, I'm talking about the use of city streets, east and west of Main. So if it were up to me, I would rank those as 1 project, and it would be my number 1. So I'll say those are number 1 and number 2, dispersed parking 1, Main Street improvement 2, shared use pathway 3, and I would love to pair bike share with that. So that would be 4. And if I had to choose a 5th one, I would be amenable to working some of the Main Street alternatives into the other projects.
Okay, thank you, Council Member Hawks. Who would like to go next? Council Member Jones.
Number 1, Cane Creek Boulevard. Number 2, Main Street improvements. Number 3, dispersed parking. And number 4, shared use path.
Thank you, Council Member Jones. Council Member Duncan.
Excuse me. Number 1 for me is the south shared use path all the way out to Kirby Lane, not necessarily all the way to the county line. Number 2 would be the south recreational parking. Number 3 would be the north recreational parking. And number 4 would be dispersed parking.
Thank you, Council Member Duncan. Council Member Guzman Newton.
Okay, so I am 1 dispersed parking, and same ideas, Jalen, I really feel like the dispersed parking and Main Street are one and the same, but so it would be dispersed parking and then Main Street improvements. And then, all right, am I not allowed to put shuttle on or transit on my list?
I mean, I think you can. I mean, we're not going to tell you can't, but
Talking about, yeah, congestion mitigation, I really feel transit is the way to go with a hotel hopper until we pick up all the housing on Spanish Valley Drive. So I'm going to say transit. And then, shoot. You can't do it without the recreation parking though. So that'd be the north and south recreation parking for me.
okay, do you have a preference between those two first, like 4 and 5?
Well, cost wise, and not.
Sorry.
No, I apologize. In terms of the rec parking.
Yeah, because they're individual projects.
Yes. So I like the idea of not having to buy property, even though I do know that the county has north. They have property at near the hub for expansion. I don't know if that would be feasible to have discussions with that. So it would be south and then north.
Okay. So real quickly before we turn it over to Evan, what we've learned is that the city wants to take our land and they want us to use the hotspot money to pave their streets. Do I want to make sure that's, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Evan, go ahead. I'm just kidding. Councilmember Clapper, you want to share with us your preferences? Oh, here he goes. He's coming. Councilmember Clapper.
What I missed? My battery died.
No problem. We need you to rank your top 4 projects from 1 to 4, 1 being your most favorite.
Well, I would like to see the Spanish Valley Path included, so I'm going to give that a high ranking. I've got a lot of feedback from folks that would, anyway. And then I would say that the off main parking in the style of Center Street ball fields is high up there, as well as I would put that as number 2. I think in that similar idea of trying to get a spot that's designated for trailer parking in the community so that trailers aren't eddying out on Main Street for 10 days at a time. I would rank 3rd a spot for that. Now I could easily be influenced one way or another, whether that's a north end or a south end, but because of the Lions Park Trail Hub, my first guess would be a south end parking, and then 4th I would put that the Main Street improvements, because I feel like that's probably going to get a lot of support. And I think to some of the earlier conversations that, a few gallons of paint could do a lot to just clean things up on 191 in the downtown area.
Okay, thank you for that, Evan. So if there's no one else, I'll give my 4. I think we've gotten everybody. Number 1 to me is the dispersed parking, the off Main Street dispersed parking, which specifically is the city streets, the side streets. And then I'll couple the improvements with that, because I wouldn't be in support of doing that without being able, to explore opportunities for some redevelopment, to incorporate public transit into that, and then also just to make it pretty and nice, pedestrian friendly. Number 3 is the multi-use pathway. I think that's the only shovel-ready project. We've heard from UDOT that they'd like to see that explore that moving forward. You know, I don't know if I want to do I have my concerns. I think the north and south recreation parking, as it could serve public transit in the future, I have my concern. You know, realistically, how well that would be utilized for recreation parking, I guess, and things like that. And so I'll probably for the bike share as kind of a small coupler to the multi-use pathway. If you're ready and able and willing, could you share with us, drum roll please, the final 4 projects that we're going to be running by Monty here shortly?
Sure. So, and I haven't done the weighting part of it. I'm not sure how we can do that, but definitely do a weight if the results are confusing or maybe not what you guys have in mind. That they would. Summer also was keeping track at the same time. So apologies if I think I was following it though. So dispersed parking got 7 votes. Main Street got 6. The improvements. Shared use path got 5. Then the next runner up with 3 was south recreational vehicle parking. Bike share got 2, and transit King Creek and northern recreational parking got 1. And alternates, Main Street alternates kind of got 1. It was Jalen's 5th option, but I did account for it.
Okay, so as it stands right now, we're looking at dispersed parking, street improvements,
and shared
and a south recreation. Before we run that by Monty, are any of the committee confused by those results?
No, I would just like to underscore the earlier point that we opened the meeting with, that it'd be nice to include a design concept on any forwarded project to include a public transit in the design for a future public transit.
And with that, thank you for that, Council Member Clapper. Monty, what do you have?
Yes.
Or thumbs up for us on that 4?
Yeah, I can. I think that list is something that we can work with. On the Main Street improvements again, I think there's quite a bit of work to do with the category of the funding. I fully expected that one to rise to the top. I voiced some of my concerns, and I've reached out. I think we're gonna have to spend some time on that to make sure that we can work through the challenges, because in general, you've heard me say this multiple times, and I'm going to say it, and you'll hear me say it again. Improvements of an enhancement type and pedestrian type tend to hinder capacity and increase congestion. So, but having said that, the fact that we're compiling that along with the dispersed parking gives, I think we've got some things that we can work with. So I think I believe we have projects there that we can work with, and we'll take some good effort.
Appreciate that, Monty. I think we can do a better job between now and our next meeting of articulating which improvements would be attached to the parking, and better defining Main Street improvements. I mean, it almost makes sense, given what the committee has said, to kind of further define the parking to include, some of those improvements, that would be subsequent to the creation of that parking. So hopefully we can get better clarity. We can get better clarity for everyone and UDOT as we move forward. But I think we've got for our core package here as we move forward in evaluation.
Right. And if I may, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I also want to reiterate what you led off with and that Councilman Clapper ended with. And I think it's very wise, and I appreciate the sentiment to include the opportunity to facilitate transit in each of these projects. You know, shuttle stops and things of that nature, I think, go a long way to help us with future needs.
Thank you. So with that, looking forward to scheduling for the next meeting. You know, guys, I really want to, as much as possible, get our work done, you know, quickly and efficiently. And so I wouldn't mind continuing on, you know, every week, if that works for everyone, just to keep us rolling. Does anyone have any objections to holding a call for the committee every week and until maybe we get to a point where we feel like we can take our foot off the gas a little bit as design work starts?
Yeah, and Curtis, what I have in mind is having a meeting with UDOT maybe later this week, Friday morning, and then we can start charting forward so we can get some input from Jeff Sanders as well as Zachariah about what kind of work needs to be done in order to evaluate these projects and vet them properly. So I think 1 week is difficult in terms of getting work out because of noticing requirements, but it might be doable. I just want to get UDOT's level of comfort with the pace.
And that meeting for Friday you're referring to, Carly, that's not for the entire committee, right?
Yeah, I think I've asked, I don't mean to put Monty on the spot. We're trying to schedule a meeting for the end of the week, just so we can understand kind of what kind of we have in mind. And yeah, we can committee on Friday and maybe try to schedule for next Wednesday.
And maybe just to give a little bit more context to that, Monty, I think, you know, one of the fundamental differences between this iteration of project identification and packaging from the first iteration is that we don't have the benefit of Fair and Piers and Jones and DeMille doing project cost estimates and you know, more project conceptualization. So that's going to have to fall on city and county staff, I think.
So yeah, I mean, an option, we could hold our meeting with staff and UDOT staff Friday and then schedule our next call for the week after next. You know, if we need a little bit more time to kind of work through that. Does that sound okay to everybody? So let's look at the week of May 18th for our next committee meeting. Let's see, we've got a county council meeting Tuesday, the 19th at 4. We could stick with Wednesdays if that's easy for everybody. Want to try that? The 20th at 1 o'clock.
Do it.
Okay.
Yep.
So I have a conflict on that day on the standing meeting that I have each month on the third Wednesday with our performance management group. It is possible that other representatives, and so you know, you probably noticed that Jared Beard, who's our district engineer, Jeff Sanders, who's our region planner, and Robert Dow, who's our operations engineer, have all been listening, have been on the call. And I've reached out to Robert recently because his expertise is in the area of operations. And when we start talking Main Street improvements, he is by far the most knowledgeable him and his staff within the region, and they've done a lot of work relative to this. And so if there's I guess I would reach out and ask, I can take a quick look at calendars and see what other staff's availability is.
Well, if we can, is there another time that works good for you, Monty, on the 20th?
On the 20th, I'm done at 2:30.
Okay.
So if we could go after 2:30 instead of the 1 o'clock as we did today, I could make that work.
Or we could do it, so we could do a 3 o'clock on Wednesday, the 20th.
Yes. Right now,
Karen?
that is
Chris?
open.
I was just gonna say, is it possible to do it the week before? I just feel like it's almost the end, almost a whole month from now, and I'm just, again, timing.
That was my concern, Karen. Thank
Oh,
you.
I'm sorry, guys. I was looking at I had my calendar messed up. So I was thinking the 13th. My bad. So we have a meeting Friday, this Friday, and we're working on a meeting to kind of get, you know, look to drill down into the evaluation of the projects and kind of map out a framework for that. So I heard some hesitation to schedule a meeting on the 6th, which is next Wednesday, a week from today. I don't know how much time we need in between Friday and the next meeting to feel comfortable that we can use everyone's time. You know, instead of noticing a 1-hour meeting next Wednesday the 6th and creating all that work, we could just notice a meeting for Wednesday the 13th and really get a better bang for our buck, I guess is what I'm thinking. We're talking about Wednesday the 13th at 1 o'clock. Does that work for everyone? Sorry for the confusion. Okay, I'm getting thumbs up. That works for you guys, Monty?
Yes. Actually, I have, I'm available at 2 o'clock on Wednesday the 13th. I'm available from 2 to 4. I have a meeting at 1 and a meeting at 4.
Okay, we'll do 2 to 4 Wednesday the 13th. Does that work for everyone? Thumbs up. Okay, thumbs up. All right, we've conducted our business, and so I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, hey, one more, so Carly, I'm afraid I missed it. I got number 1 and 2. Number 3 was the shared use path, and 4 was the south rec parking. Have I got that right?
Right.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.